Right, good evening everybody. So today what I'm going to be showing you how to do is use the Warp Stabilizer in Adobe Premiere Pro 2020. This is the same sort of method for any previous iterations of Adobe as well. But yeah, if ever you've got some footage and it's got a little bit of movement to it because you've either gone handheld or you've knocked your tripod or something like that, I'm going to show you a couple of techniques that I like to use with both the speed remapping and nesting sequences and Warp Stabilizer all in one timeline, so you can kind of get a decent stabilized piece of footage. Now the shot that I'm going to show you essentially is this one here, and this is kind of like what it looks like stabilized. And yeah, hopefully looking at it you wouldn't tell that there's any stabilization happening. There's also a lot of speed remapping happening in this sequence as well, in this scene, sorry. So this was filmed in 24 frames per second. However, I reduced it by 40%, and this also helped to sort of reduce the amount of shake that we had in this particular shot, and it extends it, so it gives us a bit longer with the two subjects here. So yeah, this is time remapped to 40% and Warp Stabilizer added as well. And yeah, I'm going to show you the technique to do this to keep it looking smooth, because as you'll notice there isn't much jitteriness that you'd normally get with 24 frames per second footage that's slowed down that much, because it's not designed to be slowed down. The clue is in the 24 frames per second bit. So yeah, let's get started. So the original clip is this sequence here, or this bit here, and this is the I'll just mute my audio, and this is the clip here. So this is unstabilized. As you can see, it's really wobbly, and even at the still part it's also a little bit shaky. You can see just happening here. So without further ado, I'm just going to pull this timeline down here, and I'll work over at this side just so we can see what's happening. So the first step I'm going to take isn't actually to apply a Warp Stabilizer. As mentioned a second ago, I did slow down this footage, so we're going to go over to speed duration, reduce it down to 40%. You'll notice it jumps from the few seconds it is over to 14 seconds. Now this is the important bit. I'm going to change the time interpolation from free sampling to optical flow, and what this does is, you can see in the sharp movements it's struggling a little bit, but at the subtle movements it's doing really well at filling in those frames. Now I can show you an example of what the frame blending does as well. So you can see the difference there. It's a lot more jittery, and it definitely looks like it's skipping some frames. And if we do this normally, it looks like this. Again, really stuttery, and if you watch her hand, you can see all this movement is still a little bit choppy. So that's what we're aiming to get rid of. So I'm just going to go back over to speed duration and change this to optical flow. And I'm just going to cut it over to, so just as a hand pops over, yeah, so from here is quite nice. Okay, now just to get rid of all of the jitteriness, I'm just going to render this frame. So just a quick one while we're here. If ever you see the red line above your clip, that means that the scene needs to be rendered, and by hitting enter you can quickly render that so you can play it through without any issues. So that's looking good. Now if ever you've done a time remap on a clip and then tried to add an effect, you'll know that Premiere Pro doesn't like doing that. So if I just type in here Warp Stabilizer, it's going to show up here. How could I not see that? Right, so if I try to drag this on there, I'm going to get the warning that says that it can't be used on the same clip. If I click it, it doesn't really give me any suggestions. So I'm just going to show you what we do in this instance. This is where nesting comes in really handy. So I'm just going to click on this and delete that Warp Stabilizer. Otherwise the warning banner will remain there. And what I'm going to do is nest this sequence. Now a nest is essentially where Premiere Pro will embed this video clip in a sequence, if you like, and it's called nesting when you then add that to another sequence. So let's get into this and I'll show you what you do. So you right click the clip, head over to nest, and I'm just going to call this stabilized footage and hit OK. Now essentially nothing should visually happen to the clip, but the timeline clip does change slightly. You can see that it's now in its own sequence, and again you've just got to hit enter to render this out, because by putting the effect in a subsequence you've got to then render the nest. So you do have to have quite a powerful machine to do this, and now you can see the same effect, everything's fine, and now we're going to get on with adding the Warp Stabilizer. So this time around the Warp Stabilizer should work without any issues. And again, I'm just going to make sure that the result is set to smooth motion. 50% should be fine. I don't want it to subspace warp, so I'm going to change this to position, scale, and rotation. Subspace warp can sometimes give you some weird shakiness happening, like a wobbly effect or a warping effect happening on your footage. That's something I want to avoid. So by changing it to position, scale, and rotation, it's just going to stabilize the footage with these three parameters in mind, and it's going to give us aim for smooth motion at 50%. Also, just be aware that you should have your framing set to stabilize, crop, and auto scale. Just selecting one of the other options will give you bars around the sides, tops, and bottoms, which can get a little bit frustrating. So the auto scale will eradicate that. And now I'm just going to hit enter again to render this. And let's play it. So now we have this as a finished result. So we've got a nice slowed down clip that takes out some of the movement, and then the Warp Stabilizer just smooths out any little bits of movement that are still present. So we've got this. Versus this one on the left. And here it is on the right. Nice and smooth. Now if we were to zoom in and you were to really stare at the pixels around the hairline, for example, then you will notice that there is a little bit of motion blurring happening, and it isn't as smooth as it could be if I'd filmed at 60 frames per second or more. But when it's scaled back like this, the overall desired effect works well. So I've done this technique a few times in the sequence that you can see here. So wherever I've got a bit of handheld footage, like this sequence here on this hair, again this is super close up. I didn't actually use the Warp Stabilizer on this. All I did was slow down the footage and just get a bit that I could work with. I find that if you've got a focus pull, like there is a very slight focus pull here, as you can see going from this pearl through to this pearls, I find that if you've got any form of focus pulling, the Warp Stabilizer gets really confused, and it can do some pretty nasty things in the background. It can make things look like that the parallax of your scene is twitching, which we don't want. So again, by using that little Warp Stabilizer slow time remapping trick, it's just helped me slow it down so I still get the right amount of time, and yeah, and it allows me to get a decent shot. So that's going to be it for this quick demo on how to use the Warp Stabilizer combined with the speed remapping settings in Premiere Pro. If you've got a little bit of shaky cam footage and it's B-roll, for example, feel free to use that slowdown technique with the Warp Stabilizer and nesting. If you're working with A-roll footage, like you know, I was going to say like you can see here, but essentially if you're working with somebody in dialogue, this won't work as well, and you might have to just try your best with the Warp Stabilizer. Just remember, Warp Stabilizer is a last resort in post. Always endeavour to get stable shots when you're out. Very difficult sometimes in run and gun situations like this, which is when knowing how to use these tools can really come in handy. So that's it for this tutorial. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.